Okay, Unit 10, Day 1. If you have your unit circle, pull that out so that you can look at that while we go through this. So first, we need to fill out this chart using the unit circle and a calculator. Okay, remember, sine is your y value, cosine is your x value. So we're looking at the y values here. So let's start with 0. So 0 radians, the value of sine at 0, the y value there is 0. 0 as a decimal is 0. And that coordinate is going to be the A column, then the B column. So that coordinate is 0, 0. Okay, if we go to pi over 6. Pi over 6, the value of sine right there. So my y value right there is 1/2. 1/2 as a decimal is 0.5. And then that point is pi over 6, comma 1/2. We're going to do the same thing for pi over 4. So the y value right there is the square root of 2 over 2. If you put that in your calculator, it's about 0.7. And then our coordinate is pi over 4, comma square root of 2 over 2. Okay, and then if we go to pi over 3, the y coordinate there is the square root of 3 over 2. That as a decimal is 0.9. And then our coordinate is pi over 3, square root of 3 over 2. Then for pi over 2, the y coordinate there is 1, which as a decimal is just 1. So that's pi over 2, comma 1. Okay, and keep going around the circle to fill this chart out. That's what it should end up being. So just pause this video and fill the rest of this chart out. Okay. Now that the chart's filled out, we're going to plot these points. So let's start with labeling our x-axis. It's already labeled up to 2 pi, but we need to label like pi 6, pi 4ths, and pi 3rds. Okay, and let's label our y-axis also. So that top one's going to be 1, the bottom will be -1. Halfway between there is a half, or 0.5, so that's 0.5 and -0.5. Halfway between 0 and 0.5 is 0.25, and that will be -0.25. And then between 0.5 and 1 is 0.75. Okay, now for the x-axis, that's pi 6, that's pi 3rds. Halfway between pi 6 and pi 3rds is pi 4ths. And it's the same right there, and right there, and right there. So that goes pi 6, pi 4ths, pi 3rds. Then 2 pi 3rds, 3 pi 4ths, 5 pi 6. 7 pi 6, 5 pi 4ths, 4 pi 3rds. Then 5 pi 3rds, 7 pi 4ths, and 11 pi 6. Okay, and then let's just start labeling. So our first coordinate is 0, 0. So that's going to be right there. Our second coordinate is pi 6 and 1/2. So that's going to be right there. That third one is pi 4ths and square root of 2 over 2, which the square root of 2 over 2 is about 0.7. So that's about right there. And then pi 3rds and the square root of 3 over 2 is 0.9. 1/2, or pi halves is 1. And then 2 pi 3rds is the square root of 3 over 2, which is that point right there. So it's about 0.9. Square root of 3 pi over 4 is the square root of 2 over 2. 5 pi over 6 is 1/2. Pi is 0. And then 7 pi 6 is -1/2. 5 pi 4ths is negative square root of 2 over 2. 4 pi 3rds is negative square root of 3 over 2. 3 pi halves is -1. 5 pi 3rds is negative square root of 3 over 2. 7 pi 4ths is negative square root of 2 over 2. 11 pi 6 is 1/2, -1/2. And 2 pi is 0. So you can see kind of a curve that we just created from those points on the unit circle. So let's just draw that curve. That is the sine curve. And you can get that from the unit circle, just from the y values on the unit circle. Okay? Let's go over some definitions. So the amplitude is the height of a periodic function from midline to the peak. And a periodic function is just a function that repeats itself. So like the sine wave is periodic because after that one cycle that we just drew, it's going to repeat that, and it's just going to continue to repeat that. And then the midline is the horizontal line that vertically bisects a periodic function. Bisects means it cuts it in half. So it splits the function in half. The trough is the minimum of a periodic function, or you can think of that as like the valley. The crest is the maximum of a periodic function, or like the peak. The period is the horizontal distance from crest to a crest. So that's a number. So the period is always a number. And then a cycle is one full repetition of the period of a periodic function, and that's a visual. So that's the difference between the period and the cycle. One's a number, the period's a number, cycle is a visual. Frequency is how often the function repeats. Between 0 and 2 pi for sine. And then sinusoidal is just the sine wave. That's just another name for the sine wave. Then I want you to put one more on here, or maybe I don't. Oh, I will on this next one. Okay, so if we're given f of x equals a sine of b, x minus c plus d, a, b, c, and d all mean something different to this sine function. So a is the amplitude. And it's a equals 1 for the basic sine of x. So f of x equals sine of x. So just the parent function. The period is 2 pi divided by your b value. And that's 2 pi divided by 1, which equals 2 pi for just your basic sine of x. The horizontal shift is c. And that's always opposite of what you think. So like if it's minus c, that's really moving it right. And if it's plus c, it's going to move it left. I'll explain that later. But it's c equals 0 for your basic sine of x. Your vertical shift is d, and that moves it up or down. It's vertical, and it's d equals 0 for your basic sine of x. And your frequency is 1 over the period. And our period is 2 pi over b, so it's 1 over 2 pi over b, which is the same thing as 1 divided by 2 pi over b. If you divide by a fraction, you can flip that fraction and multiply. So that's 1 times b over 2 pi, which is just b over 2 pi. And it's 1 over 2 pi for the basic sine of x function. Okay, and then the last thing is your midline, and your midline is just y equals whatever your d value is. Okay, so like if d is 4, then the midline is y equals 4. If d is 5, then the midline is y equals 5. For the basic sine of x function, I didn't write that. It's just y equals 0. Okay? So now we need to evaluate these functions and write the exact form. So if we have f of 4 pi thirds, we're going to find 4 pi thirds either on our unit circle or on our sine wave or on our little chart that we drew. 4 pi thirds is right there. And that x value, or that y value, is negative square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so you could also go to 4 pi thirds on your unit circle, and then the y value there is negative square root of 3 over 2, and that's the same thing. Okay, then for 7 pi 6, it's negative 1/2. Pi fourths, square root of 2 over 2. 3 pi halves, that's negative 1. 3 pi fourths, square root of 2 over 2. And then pi is just 0. Okay, so we kind of did that last unit too. Just use your unit circle, or you can use the sine wave to do this. Okay? So we need to find the amplitude, the period, and then we need to graph this. So basically, we just need to label our a and our b value. My a is 1/2, my b is 2. That means my amplitude is 1/2, and I need to use the b to find my period. So the period is always 2 pi divided by b, which is 2 pi divided by 2 since b equals 2, which is pi. Okay, and the sine wave makes an S shape, and you always start at the origin. So my first point is at 0, 0. First, last, and middle are the same, because if you're going to make an S shape, you're going to hit the same line 1 time, or 3 times. So first, last, and middle are the same. The last point is at the period. So if my period's pi, I'm going to go to pi, and I'm going to draw a point right there. Then go halfway between those at pi halves, and we're going to draw a point right there, because first, last, and middle are the same. Then to make the S shape, we're going to go halfway between the first and the middle point, and we're going to go up our amplitude, and then we're going to go halfway between the first, or the middle and the last point, and go down our amplitude. So my amplitude is 1/2. I'm going to go to pi fourths because that's halfway between 0 and pi halves and go up a half. Then I'm going to go halfway between pi halves and pi and go down a half. Okay, and then this pattern just repeats itself. So at 5 pi fourths, I'm going to go up a half. 3 pi halves, it's at 0. 7 pi fourths, it's down a half. 2 pi, it's 0. Okay, and then there's our sine wave. Let's do another example. So here, my A is 3, my B is 1/2. Because if you have theta over 2, that's the same thing as, we could rewrite this as 3 sine of 1/2 theta. That's the same thing. So my amplitude is 3. I need to find my period. The period's 2 pi divided by b. Well, b is 1/2. So that's 2 pi divided by 1/2. You can flip that fraction and multiply. So that's 2 pi times 2 over 1, which is 2 pi times 2, which is 4 pi. So my period is 4 pi. To graph this, first, last, and middle are the same, and you start at the origin. So there's my first point, there's my last point, there's my middle point, and then I'm going to go halfway between. Wait, I want to go back and explain that again. So first point is at 0, 0. Your last point is at the period, so the last point is at 4 pi. Halfway between 0 and 4 pi is 2 pi, so that's right there. Then you're going to go halfway between those first two, and go up your amplitude, and then halfway between the second two, go down your amplitude. So I'm going to go to pi, I'm going to go up 3, and then I'm going to go to 3 pi, and I'm going to go down 3. And then that pattern just repeats. So at 5 pi, I go up 3, and then at 6 pi, it's at 0. And there's my sine wave. Cool? We're going to save those next two for class. Then these last ones, so we need to find the midline and the frequency of each function. So first label A, B, C, and D. So in this one, my A is 2, my B is 1, I don't have a C value, and my D is 3. So first I want to label the midline. Well, the midline is y equals D. Well, my D value is 3, so the midline's y equals 3. The frequency is b over 2 pi. My b value is 1, so that's just 1 over 2 pi. And you're done. Okay, if we look at example B, let's label our A, B, C, and D. So A is 1, B is 3, C is 2, and D is -5. So my midline is y equals D, which is y equals -5. Then my frequency is b over 2 pi, so that's 3 over 2 pi. And you're all done. Cool? Please take the quiz, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Remember, I am checking off your notes. So if you didn't take notes on this, go back and rewatch it and take notes. That's your fault. But just remember to take the quiz. I'll see you guys tomorrow.